right, good afternoon, students, faculty, and staff. My name is Claudia Catoda, and I'm the Chief Diversity Officer and Special Assistant to the President. Thank you for joining us today for today's special edition of Community Conversation. Today's conversation will focus on last week's presidential elections. I would like to first thank ASI for this partnership on the Community Conversation. Today's conversation will be recorded and posted on a Division of Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance website. And as a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists, please type your questions in the Q&A section and we will present them to the panelists after their discussion. I would like now to invite Ignacio Castillo, ASI Vice President of Legislative Affairs, to provide a welcome. Ignacio?
Well, thank you so much, Claudia, for everything. I want to say thank you to Roadrunners and good afternoon. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to everyone who is in attendance today. I also want to thank everyone who will be joining us as panelists. We have three amazing panelists who have contributed heavily to CSUB, not only as political science professors, but as engaged members in Kern County. Dr. Kraybill, Dr. Carnegie, and Dr. Martinez. It is a pleasure to be part in this collaborative effort with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I am truly proud that our runner family has been engaged in this year's election and for reaching out and using their voices in the polls. I am pleased to be in this position as Vice President of Legislative Affairs to announce that most of our CSUB students have registered to vote, which is truly amazing and astonishing. But mostly our focus this year on ASI has been in correlation with the election has been on ensuring that students are actually registered to vote and actually voting in this year's election. With that being said, it has been a pleasure to be in this position to help students use their voice and take whatever social issues or issues they have to the polls this year and using their voices to create change across Kern County and across the state and federal level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ignacio. I would like now to welcome today's panel of experts from CSUB's Department of Political Science. We have Dr. Ivy Cargile, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Dr. Jeanine Kraybill, Associate Professor of Political Science, and Dr. Mark Martinez, Department Chair and Professor of Political Science. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Kraybill.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this community conversation so we can debrief the 2020 presidential election. So without further ado, we'll go to the next slide. So first, before we get started, I think that it's very important that we take a moment to celebrate the record number of individuals that turned out to vote. Voting is such a key part of our democracy. Like John Lewis, the late John Lewis told us, it's almost sacred. And so to see so many people come out and, exercise the franchise and push us to almost a 72% voter turnout among all eligible voters. So when you think about it, the United States population is over 300 million. Our voting age population is over 257 million. And our voting eligible population is 239 million or slightly over that. So when we're starting to get into the 70th percentile in terms of people turning out to vote, that means that people were paying attention. And so I think that regardless of whom you voted for, that is something really to celebrate. And I'm really proud of all our young people that turned out to vote as we're starting to see that really shape the election. I won't go to that hyperlinked slide because I know we're a little pressed on time, but we do know that the outcome, at least right now, is that we have a President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris that will be sworn in January. And we'll go over some of the issues that may be leading this to be contested for just a little longer. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the things that I was asked to talk about from ASI was to give you just a basic rundown of the Electoral College. So, even though many of us on this Zoom webinar today voted when we, just talking about that record level of voter turnout, When we vote, we really don't vote directly for the president. We're voting for a slate of electors that will hopefully go along with the will of the popular vote in each of our states. So we have a very decentralized electoral system, and particularly when it comes to the president. So you can think about when the Electoral College is going to meet on December 14th, they're almost like a little mini Congress that is going to be voting, hopefully, in the will of the popular votes in each of their respective states. So we have 538 members of the Electoral College, and the way that that works is it's made up of basically our representatives in the National Congress. So we have 435 members in the House, we have 100 members in the Senate, and Washington, D.C. gets 3 electoral votes. The way that it works is when the framers first initiated it, you had the state legislatures that would pick who these electors were going to be. You'd have an election, you'd have a popular vote in the election, but it didn't mean that electors were necessarily going to go with the popular vote in each of their respective states. The idea was that they were going to deliberate over the popular vote, and you could very well have a president and vice president that were elected and be from 2 different parties. And so whomever was the top vote getter would be the president, and then second to that would be the vice president. I think it's really important when this question was asked for me to address, and then I'll talk about the reforms in just a moment of how the Electoral College operates now, or what we would call Electoral College kind of 2.0. But the framers, when we think about why they chose this system, I think it's really important for us to be honest. They were addressing slavery concerns in the southern states. The southern states wanted to make sure that they were going to have a sufficient amount of electoral votes. This also starts to spur the conversation, the very unfortunate conversation of the 3/5 compromise, where they wanted their slaves to count towards part of their population, so it would count towards their representation in Congress. This really is showing that both something like the 3/5 compromise and the Electoral College immediately institutionalized racism in our country. And that's one of the long-standing criticisms, to be honest with you, about the Electoral College. There was also debates on philosophical concerns about a popularly elected leader and wanting to make sure that we wouldn't have a demagogue that would appeal to the masses, promise them the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then enforce tyranny on them. So it was this idea that the Electoral College might act as a buffer between the elected president and raw public opinion. And there's other thoughts, but those are some of the condensed ones I'll share right now. Contemporary, the way that the contemporary view of the Electoral College is now those electors, even though states, really run our elections and state legislatures do have a say. Now you have a lot of state statutes where the way the popular vote goes is the way that the Electoral College representatives, or that slate of electors, has to vote in their states. The other thing too now is electors are, and this is a late 19th century reform, electors are chosen by the party. So you usually are not someone that's a current office holder. You can't be someone, this is a reform of the Civil War, you can't be in a state of treason with the United States. So for instance, a very famous elector this time around from the state of New York is going to be Hillary Clinton, and I'm sure she's going to be casting her vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. States can also now punish faithless electors. So for example, we had a court case that was actually decided just this summer. It was Schilafino versus the state of Washington, and it dealt with both faithless electors that were supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton, but voted for Colin Powell, and they were fined, and they contested that. But the Supreme Court ruled that it wasn't a violation of their freedom of speech, and that because states run elections, that they have the absolute ability to mandate that an elector has to go along with the popular vote, or there could be a punishment, something that's punitive. We can come back to this in the Q&A, but something to think about that always comes up every election season is whether or not we should just go with the popular vote. And so if we get time, I think that's something we might want to talk about in terms of what would be the pros and the cons of keeping an electoral college vis-a-vis just going with a popular vote. Next slide, please. Okay. So this has been a touchy subject, voting by mail. I am here to tell you that voting fraud by mail is super, super, super small, less than 1%. You have had reputable institutions such as MIT that have done long trend studies showing that voter fraud is actually incredibly nil and incredibly small. Voting by mail is actually a very safe practice. And part of that speaks to because of our decentralized system of voting. So on election day, we actually have thousands of elections going on because they're going on county by county by county across the 50 states. The way that it works is, and you also have a variety of laws depending on the state, since states oversee elections. But just to give you a sense of the process, since this was also asked for me to cover by ASI, when people either vote in person or on election day, or they're voting in advance by mail, what happens is you have the votes that start to get counted. The curing of ballots has to deal with if there's any error in a ballot. That's what it means. You're going to cure the ballot. So you have some states, for example, that if they notice that the way you register to vote, your signature is not matching, how you registered when you filled out a voter registration form, for example. If you did it in person, you signed a card, for instance. Well, say you turn in your ballot in that envelope that we all got, since I'm assuming most of us voted from California. If those two signatures look like they're not matching, for example, that would cause a voting official to work through a process of curing a ballot. So a voter, depending on the state, could be contacted. You could show different forms of ID, for example. And again, the time period that would take varies by state. But even the signatures or any kind of ballot or voting irregularity is looked over by county officials. We also have a certification process, and every state, again, because we have a decentralized model, has different deadlines by which votes have to be certified. But the way that it works is essentially the Secretary of State has each of the counties in a state go through that curing process, go through any voting irregularities, separate any ballots that may have irregularities and where voters need to get contacted or unfortunately need to be tossed out because there seems to be a striking error. And then once that process is done, they report to their respective secretaries of state to confirm that they are completed with their certification process. And that process of each secretary of state working through those counties is called canvassing. Voting by mail's history stems from the Civil War. So we have had it, since the 1860s. Oregon was the first state to pass an initiative to start statewide voting by mail. Also, before 2020, you had states like Colorado, Hawaii, and Utah. And then we know that California has done it this election, but in the state of California, that's been really increasing since the 1990s. And particularly with that piece of legislation, AB 860 is what authorized it across the state this year. Next, please. Next slide. Okay, very good. So another thing that has seemed to be on all of our minds are the outcome of the election. So we know that Joe Biden has won the popular vote in an absolute record, garnering the most votes that we have seen a presidential candidate garner. And he has also will be solidifying the Electoral College most likely. But we are seeing a lot of legal challenges on behalf of the Trump administration. And perhaps you're not surprised by that because this was part of a narrative that the administration that had been discussing really through spring when the pandemic went into a shutdown mode and there was still primaries that were going on in the Democratic Party, and you had states move to more of a voting by mail system in the primaries. So that started the Trump administration falsely casting doubt in the voting by mail system. So that priming of the pump that occurred is in line with his rhetoric now, unfortunately. And we know that President Trump at about 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday prematurely declared himself the victor. And in certain states, he wanted counting to continue, like in Arizona, but he wanted it to stop in the blue wall in Michigan. And now he is filing lawsuits, but he was filing lawsuits too, even before the election, about these voter by mail ballots. So let's quickly recap some of the lawsuits that have taken place since election night. So Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada are the ones that are probably the most talked about, even though they are committing to file more. In Pennsylvania, and I should also preface it that the administration so far has not been successful in these lawsuits that have been filed. A lot of them have been outright dismissed in the last 7 days because if you are going to go to court, not only do you have to show a grievance and a claim, you have to show evidence to back that claim. And a lot of these states are still in process of certifying their ballots. So there was no evidence really before, and there's not evidence coming out now. So in the state of Pennsylvania, some of the issues the Trump administration is attacking is that they extended the deadline for accepting ballots 3 days after the election, as long as they were postmarked. They wanted to stop that process, and that was denied by both a state and federal judge. The RNC, the Republican National Committee in Pennsylvania, is still committed to ongoing lawsuits because they are deeming the process of voting by mail unfair. In Michigan, the Trump administration has tried to get the state to delay its actual certification process so that it cannot declare a resolute winner. And what they're trying to claim is that there hasn't been enough transparency in the voting process and in the counting process. And you had a circuit court judge deny their request. In the state of Arizona, and this was even, discredited by Homeland Security and other entities. There was this false claim that ballots were rejected if they were filled out by a Sharpie pin. That's been completely debunked, but it's still a narrative that the Trump administration is pushing. In Georgia, a judge granted an outright dismissal of the Trump campaign's lawsuit that was alleging that they were receiving ballots after 7 p.m. after election day and still counting. And in the state of Georgia, that was the cutoff. So again, we have a decentralized system and every state is different. So I told you Pennsylvania was 3 days after the election. For Georgia, the cutoff was 7 p.m. on election night. But a judge found no irregularities or no evidence that that type of counting after 7 p.m. was taking place. And then in Nevada, the Trump administration has been arguing that there's irregularities in some of the verifying of signatures on the ballots. And again, that suit has also been dismissed. Some are asking, well, when might the Supreme Court intervene? Well, if we go back to 20 years ago in the 2000 election, the Supreme Court waited really till the state of Florida, it worked through that court process. So it would most likely, if it was going to happen, it would be after some of these states' legal processes were exhausted. Next slide, please. For the sake of time, I'm only going to say a couple things from this slide so I can turn it over to Doctors Cargile and Martinez. Now we're starting to get into this discussion because Donald Trump will not concede the election results. And we know that he's filing multiple lawsuits on, well, what are we going to do? We've had this history of a peaceful transition of power. We have had a peaceful transition of power ever since we've had the first party turnover in 1800. Even though the Federalists and Anti-Federalists did not know that they were creating parties, we know in hindsight they were. So when Thomas Jefferson becomes the winner of the election of 1800, that's when the Anti-Federalists take over from the Federalists, which were Washington and Adams. And that modeled a peaceful transition of power. I mean, even think about Hillary Clinton, for example, in the 2016 election. Within just a few hours, she had conceded that election, even though she only lost by razor thin margins throughout the blue wall. And there was some people questioning the outcome, and she had won the popular vote by 3 million. So we've always depended on presidents to adhere to that. You've also probably been hearing about a woman named Emily Murphy in the General Services Administration. She's the director of that agency and a Trump appointee. She's refusing to sign off on the declarations that the Biden and Harris team need, which grants them actually the process of transitioning. About $10 million is the fee or the cost of transitioning. Office space, access to security briefings, things of that nature. I think it's important to bear in mind that in the election of 1960, when Richard Nixon was running against John F. Kennedy, there was a lot of discussion as to whether there was voter fraud and also voter intimidation in places like Illinois and Texas. And immediately, the Nixon camp was pressuring Nixon to contest the voting outcome. But even Nixon refused within 2 days to do that. And his quote is, "Our country can't afford the agony of a constitutional crisis." And even later on, after he resigned from the White House and in his own biography, he still really believed that there was wrongful voting in that election, but he knew that the country needed to move forward. Next slide. So lastly, I was asked, what should you do now that the election is over to stay engaged? Well, stay informed. Keep tabs on your local officials and what they're saying. Some of our local officials are saying some very interesting things about the election outcome. And so holding them accountable, watch and attend community meetings such as this. Dr. Martinez is on a committee that is looking at police reform, for example, for BPD. You can be creating information groups among your friends. There's a lot of future leaders on this participant list. You can be seriously thinking about running for office yourself. You can get engaged with organizations like protectthevote.net. And even after the election, they get teams of people that monitor false information on social media. And then I have a list of organizations you can think about volunteering your time to. Thank you so much. I think we're ready for Dr. Cargile.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this community conversation around this year's presidential election. We are glad that you are joining us for this post-election chat. And I just want to take the time to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this event and inviting us in the political science department to provide some context and hopefully inspire some interesting conversation. So thank you to the President's Office and to ASI and everyone who is here today with us. Slide. So today, I'd like to discuss the role of political behavior in this year's election, which has felt like an eternity. Particularly, I'd like to discuss the role of the Latino, Latina, Latinx voter, as well as provide some context regarding the Black vote. So the week before the election, probably around the week of Halloween, there was all of this attention by both the national and the local media that was being paid to the fact that some Latino, Latina, Latinx voters were saying that they were going to support Donald Trump, which is something that most folks don't expect. We saw headlines like the ones that you're seeing on the slide. As you can imagine, people were and have been in an uproar about how and why it was possible that the Latino, Latina, Latinx community could support Donald Trump. So I'd like to clarify a couple of things regarding this population based on research that is done both in political science as well as in sociology. A lot of the shock regarding support for Donald Trump by the Latino, Latina, Latinx population is really as a result of how insulting he has been and how painful some of his policy positions have been when it has come to this particular population. Next slide. So to start off, this population of people who are from different countries, but who are connected by the Spanish language and for many the immigrant experience, still has quite a few of intergroup differences. In other words, this population is not a monolith, and I cannot repeat that enough. They do not have similar lived experiences to the degree that perhaps the Black American Mexican population has. They do not come from home countries with the same conditions, whether they be economically or politically. For those who immigrated here, the reasons could be different. And for some, particularly those here in the Southwest, for example, in Colorado, California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, etc., the border crossed them and not the other way around. So as you see on the slide, this label of Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx is a US created term. And the false assumption is that once Mexicans, Colombians, Hondurans, Guatemalans, etc., step on US soil, they're all supposed to identify with this label. However, identity does not develop that way. It takes time, context, and education for a pan-ethnic group to identify pan-ethnically, which is something that the political establishment to this day hasn't really invested any kind of resources into. Furthermore, to think that all of a sudden immigrants from Latin America and those of Latin descent who are already here are automatically going to think political institutions and candidates they're going to think about them in the same manner is not accurate, and it's actually very misleading. This is not to say, though, that folks from this population do not have some shared lived experiences that are going to inform their decision making, but we would be wrong to think that this will be the experience for everyone. This is why I think it's really important that we really understand this group of individuals and that we learn about them in a disaggregated manner, meaning that we learn about them in a way where we think about them individually from their different home countries. In other words, understand that there are differences, and also to understand what are the differences between, for example, Mexicans or people coming from Central America or folks coming from South America. So if we understand the Latino, Latina, Latinx community under this context, this is going to provide us more information regarding what their political behavior should look like. Now, I do want to say, however, that while we do want to think about the fact that this community does have some different lived experiences, in general, right, this community tends to band together and work together because they are Spanish speaking, because of the fact that they do have the immigrant experience. And so therefore there is power in numbers, and we will see that they do have some shared political opinions. But what I want to temper is the idea that they should all think the same way. That's just not possible. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So as we can see here, right, they do share some same policy issue opinions. In this slide, I provide data from an election eve survey that was conducted by Latino Decisions from October 23rd through November 2nd, which shows which policy issues Latino, Latina, Latinxes, as well as other non-white and white voters considered to be important for this year's presidential election. The survey is of over 15,000 respondents, and it was conducted in different languages, not just in English. So here on this slide, we can see that primarily for voters of color, the pandemic is most important. For Latino, Latina, Latinxes, the pandemic matters because not only are many of them essential workers, but many are uninsured or underinsured. Data from the Pew Research Center finds that 25% of Latino, Latina, Latinxes are uninsured, and nearly half of all undocumented immigrants, which I need to remind you are not just Latino, Latina, Latinxes, also lack healthcare insurance, which means that there are a lot of essential workers out there without any means for treatment if they do get COVID. The other issue that magnifying the pandemic for this group is the fact that per the CDC, they have the second highest numbers of reported deaths due to COVID for non-white individuals in the United States. So you can understand why this issue matters to them. We also see here that jobs and the economy matter for them, but more so for the Asian American Pacific Islander voters, followed by healthcare costs, which is actually ranked higher by Asian American Pacific Islanders. And the last two important issues on which both Latino, Latina, Latinxes and Black voters agree are discrimination and racial justice, as well as police brutality. Moreover, these issue priorities do show us that there is some agreement on what matters politically and policy-wise for the Latino, Latina, Latinx population, but it all needs to be understood with the caveat that not all members of this group will think the same. Will think the same issues are important or will like the same candidates. Next slide. In this slide, we see preliminary findings of how white and non-white voters voted in this presidential election. Now, please understand that this is as of November 3rd. So again, we're still getting a lot more. We're getting a lot more data in as the states finish up their tally. So these numbers will probably change, but not by very much. We can see here that the biggest supporters of the Biden-Harris ticket was the Black community, and then that was followed by the Latino, Latina, Latinx population. And for the Trump-Pence ticket, we see they received their biggest support from white voters. Turning more specifically to the Latino, Latina, Latinx population, we do see an interesting increase from 2016. After more precise calculations and fixing of some polling issues that were had, Latino Decisions found in 2016 that there was Latino, Latina, Latinx support for Trump, but that range was within 18 to 22%. In 2020, we can see that that clearly went up. While not all of the, and like I said, while not all the tallies are in, these numbers are probably gonna stay somewhat similar. And so this data does show then, as you can see, that about 27% of Latino, Latina, Latinxes in fact supported the Trump-Pence ticket. Some of you may be wondering how this is the case, and this is exactly what the media was wondering a week before the election, and even to this day, I'm still getting media calls about it. And some of it we can attribute to what I said earlier, but also we cannot ignore the fact that some people who do identify with as Latino, Latina, Latinx also identify as conservative and therefore are supportive of Republican candidates. Also, Trump is the incumbent, and he did begin his re-election campaign in 2017, the day after Inauguration Day. So some of the traction that he got is because his campaign has been doing the outreach and they've been doing the work, and it has resulted in voter increase. And for some of these individuals, the insults that he's hurled at Latino, Latina, Latinxes, the fact that he separated babies and children from their parents at the border are not situations that offended their sensibilities, and therefore they were happy to support Donald Trump and Michael Pence. Some policy issues just appeared, as I said, to matter more for Latino, Latina, Latinx Trump supporters that resulted in him receiving this increase. However, though, let's also take a look and be mindful of the fact that the Biden-Harris ticket is the ticket that received the most support from not just the Latino, Latina, Latinx community, but also the Black community and the Asian American Pacific Islander community and the American Indian community. So you can see when it comes to white and non-white voters, there is quite an interesting distinction there. Next slide. Another expectation that folks had regarding voter turnout is that there was going to be a gender gap in the overall vote. Since about the 1980s, political scientists began to notice the difference in the way that men and women voted in general. The trend has been that women have voted more liberally, ideologically speaking, than have men. But interestingly enough, it was not until about 10 years ago in 2010 that researchers began to disaggregate the women's vote in order to see who is driving this gap. So is it the fact that all women are more ideologically liberal than men, or is it that one or two or three groups of women, different types of women, are the ones that are driving this gap? Next slide. Since 2010, the trend that has been noticed is very similar to what happened last Tuesday night. Generally, men tend to lean more conservative ideologically speaking, therefore more supportive of the Republican ticket. This is a thread that runs across race and ethnicity, which you can see here on the slide. Overwhelmingly, support for Trump-Pence is coming from white men, followed by voters that are identified as all other voters, and those are probably your Asian American Pacific Islander, as well as your biracial or multiracial voters. Following them is the Latino, Latina, Latinx group of men, and then finally Black men. Folks have also been taken very aback by the fact that there is Black male support for Trump-Pence, given his comments about Colin Kaepernick, as well as his continual touting of himself as the law and order president, which many of us understand that to be as coded language for not believing that there are disproportionate killings of Black and brown people across the United States, and that our prison system across the country is disproportionately Black and brown. Additionally, a lot of people of color, particularly Black people, felt that his handling of this summer's protest was abysmal, as well as his lack of really even acknowledging the racial reckoning that the United States is having. But again, as with the Latino, Latina, Latinx population, we have to remember that the Black community also has its conservatives, and they identify as Republican, and they came out for Trump Pence, and also to some degree, the Black community is not a monolith. Now with women, we see similar trends, and the gaps are there. More white women supported Trump Pence, but also more white women supported Biden Harris than did white men. So relative to white men, you saw that the support in the white community for Biden Harris came from white women. This is in line with new and emerging scholarship that is investigating the reasons why white women have have a conservative and Republican leanings. Latina women preferred Biden Pence by 39 percentage points than did Latino men, but overwhelming support for Biden Pence came from Black women with a 81 percentage point difference. This is why on Saturday night, if you heard President-elect Biden speak at his victory rally, he indicated that he owes this election to Black women. Across states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Wisconsin, we saw Black women step up against the Trump Pence ticket and in favor of Biden Harris. Similarly, though, you see that with Latina women, particularly in states like Arizona and Nevada and in Colorado, that Latina women also stepped up in favor of Biden Harris and against the Trump Pence ticket. So with all of this said, similar to the year 2020, this election has felt crazed and chaotic, but my hope is that I've left you with a somewhat better understanding than you previously had about the political behavior in this year's election. With that said, thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at the end. I turn it over to Dr. Martinez.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the international developments and ramifications of the election. In order to get there, I'm going to let you know that I'm not going to talk about national security, alliance building, personalities like Putin or in North Korea. We just don't have enough time. So what I do want to talk about is the environment we're looking at, especially when it comes to commerce and trade. Given what we've been experiencing over the past 20-something years, and especially with the great market crash, and there's another one coming, I think we want to understand what's happening on the international horizon. So I think it's Jorge who's doing the slide. So if you can get to the next slide, I want everyone to understand that we've actually been watching the divisions and the breakdowns and tensions internationally, even before Donald Trump arrived on the scene. So I want to make sure that we understand that Trump doesn't get the blame for what's happening and the trends, but he definitely gets a lion's share of the blame for exacerbating what we've been seeing happening, the tensions around the world, especially with some of the antagonisms as they apply to tariffs and some of the commercial disagreements that we've had with our neighbors. And as a matter of fact, if we think about what's happened, next slide, please, over the past couple of decades, increasingly the rancor and the disagreements over commercial agreements, but especially in the area of currencies and currency war, we're not going to get into that here. But here's the key: whether it's tariff wars, whether it's currency wars, whether it's trade disagreements on material matters of industry, we're not doing too good. Next slide, please. And if we look at what these tensions are built around, and why they've been developing over the last 20, 30 years, this is something that we need a steady hand in. And I think this is where Biden coming in is going to be a very calming influence internationally. There's absolutely one thing that Biden was known for, and that was for the respect he had around the world and his understanding of international relations and America's role in the global community, especially in pulling together alliances, et cetera. And so, but the world today that we see, next slide, is very tense. The world today, especially after the market collapse and with COVID-19, we have a very precarious economic situation where we have regular bailouts that don't say or tell us that the world we live in is a stable economic environment. We cannot continue to have a bailout after bailout after bailout when we're looking at a supposedly strong market economy. But then anytime we get a hiccup, there's the call for $1 trillion bailouts. And this tells us a lot about the things that we're going to be confronting, not just in the United States, but around the world when it comes to debt, when it comes to currency battles, when it comes to tariff wars, and the rise of very competitive regional trading blocks, excuse me. And so what the real problem is, in the next slide, is that we tend to look at the world and we have this fear of, especially things that we can't control. Let's just be blunt here. China really is not paying attention to the United States, what the United States is doing, even though this is what America sees when we're looking at China, and we like to blame everything that's going wrong with the commercial developments in the United States on China and other countries. Reality is, so what no one is seeing is that what we're experiencing today, next slide, please. What we're experiencing today is very much what we experienced right before the Great War that we all know of, and that begins in the 1930s and drags the United States in 1941. Because if you look at what we have, the tensions around debt, currency battles, tariff wars, regional trade blocks, all of this stuff is very apparent. As a matter of fact, if we look at what we saw, not just internationally, but also in domestic arenas around the world, but especially in the United States. The next slide, please. What we see are many of the same tensions that we saw in the 1930s. And think about this. If you look at the rise of the American Nazi Party in the 1930s, in America, there's calls for America first. And then the fact that we had an economic crisis, we were calls for protectionism, hostility towards minorities, the Jews, a sense that democracy is failing us. And so what that brings us to is this understanding that there are a lot of tensions domestically that are going to be exacerbated by what we see internationally. Next slide, please. Because what we're heading towards, whether you voted for Biden or not, are these very tense commercial negotiations that eventually, throughout history, have led to commercial wars. And then what we need to worry about, next slide, please, is that we do have people who have a very, very much a vested interest in watching and having the United States take a dive internationally. There are countries that will benefit from the problems and the challenges that the United States are going to be facing over the next decade. And again, it doesn't matter whether you voted for Biden or voted for Trump. These things have been brewing for the last 30 years. Again, unfortunately, President Trump exacerbated all these problems. But here's the issue. What we need to keep in mind is as we watch these things, anything can be a spark plug. Next slide, please. What we need to keep in mind is that there are times when events escape human control. And when they do, we always need to recall, next slide, please, and that'll be the final one, that there are lessons of war that we tend to learn at the time of war, but unfortunately, every generation seems to need to relearn these lessons. And I'll leave it at that because I think we only have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And if those of you are interested, I know the bigger questions are dealing with what's happening on the domestic front, but you want to take some classes with Dr. Horn, myself, or even in the history department with, I'll just plug the history department as well. Okay, questions?
Thank you, Dr. Kraybill, Dr. Martinez, and Dr. Cargile. We have a lot of questions coming through. So we'll start first with Stephanie Enriquez. Stephanie says, I am writing a new story for my journalism class, and I would like to ask, how important was the youth vote in this election? Go ahead, Abby, or Dr. Cargile.
Thank you. So if, as far as we can tell, the youth vote actually, like very similar to what Dr. Kraybill said, we have historic numbers of folks that showed up. At this point, what is being reported based on the numbers on the ballots that have been counted, the youth vote, 18 to 29-year-old accounted, I mean, it went up about 10%, 10 to 12% from last election, and it reflects about 50 to 53% of 18 to 29-year-olds showed up to the polls or voted early in this year's election, which is pretty historic for this group. So the youth vote actually did turn out, and so this is where I think Dr. Kraybill's comments in terms of staying plugged in and staying engaged is so important in order to continue those numbers, and also to continue, and also for politicians to start to really pay attention to this segment of the electorate, because it is your voices are important, and your voices need to be heard.
Thank you, Dr. Cargile. Dr. Kraybill, Dr. Martinez, anything you'd like to add?
Just that I would encourage, thank you. And I think also, I'm not sure if at the beginning, since I was thinking about the time, if I didn't get a chance to thank you, Claudia, and your team for putting this together. So thank you so very much. I would just really add that sometimes voting groups can kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy when you don't think that you're paying attention to. It's one of those things, well, if you start showing up, you get paid attention to, they'll see the full scope and breadth of your force. And I think that is the case with the youth vote. At times the youth vote isn't always consistent, but hopefully our youth stay engaged, because when they coalesce, they are a huge force. And then you'll get candidates that really pay attention to what is on the table for you. And so I would really encourage our younger voters. And I know, like, for example, yesterday in presidential politics, it was very exciting, and I want to applaud those. I'm not sure how many are on in the audience, but there were several of you that were first-time voters for the first time. That's incredibly exciting. And so, the thing is too, is, some of our discussion yesterday was about that not everyone was necessarily excited about the candidates. And that's understandable. Sometimes you don't always get the candidate that maybe you were hoping for in the primary. But remember, there's so many things on the ballot that really need your attention at the state level, at the local level. We had a dozen propositions on the ballot in the state of California, right? And so I would really implore you to stay engaged. I know it sounds kind of cheesy and cliche, but it's so true. You are absolutely our future. And obviously, the way we're doing it, we're having a hard time figuring it out. So we need y'all, right? We need y'all, and we need your vision. And I think that you could do better than what we're doing. So we really need you to be engaged. And I believe in each and every single one of yours individual power and collective power.
Thank you. Our next question is from Denise Gonzalez. Denise asks, would you say there has been an increase in voter intimidation during this election cycle? If so, who are those most being affected?
Do you want to take that one? Maybe Dr. Cargile or Dr. Martinez?
I see Dr. Martinez pointing at someone.
He's pointing at us.
You guys go for it.
So I know that in the media in the run-up to the election, there was a lot of conversation about voter intimidation, particularly particularly in those states that didn't do vote by mail and that had a lot of in-person voting. From what I've seen so far, there haven't been a lot of reports about voter intimidation. It appeared, and this is anecdotal, I haven't done the extensive digging on this, but it appears that in the states and in the areas where there were a lot of voters of color, that is where there were calls for people to show up to watch the polls, but also please understand that every state has laws that say that if you are going to be there as a poll watcher, and a lot of times for most elections, the political parties have poll watchers that they appoint and are there for all of the elections. But there are guidelines. They have to stand anywhere between 6 to 10 feet away from folks. They can't talk to them. They can't really answer questions either. And it's supposed to be very clear that they're there watching the election, on behalf of the Democratic Party or on behalf of the Republican Party. I know that there were calls on election night to particular voters of color, telling them not to show up and vote, but immediately that was curbed. So, unfortunately, it's not clear as of yet if any of these tactics worked, and it's also not clear who was doing it. I know the FBI has started, from what I've seen in the news, the FBI has started to do some investigation into this, but we don't know what the results are at this point. And I don't know if Dr. Kraybill knows a little bit more that she can add.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cargile. I think we're waiting to kind of see if there has been any, type of reports on that. I think, and again, this is just anecdotal and just kind of living in the world and, being a political scientist and a social scientist and digesting everything, that you have to remember we had record voting by mail. So that very well could have kind of depressed some of that intimidation factor. And again, this is just anecdotal. This is just you don't have to agree with me by any stretch of the imagination, but I wonder, what doctors Martinez and Cargile might think of this thought. I'm wondering too, because we have been in such a polarizing time, and we had such a, I think that one can make the argument that we've always lived too in a racially polarized environment. Perhaps we're just seeing it more now because of media, social media, things of that nature. But given where we were in the spring and the summer with the racial social tension we were seeing, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, that I think that some groups that may have even been a catalyst to make sure that they voted by mail, they might not have wanted to engage in any of that. And again, I have not done a study, a post-election survey on that. These are just thoughts too. You have to remember that we're digesting this as political scientists, and also, as Americans, right? And as voters. And so sometimes these are some of my own, raw thoughts that I'm looking into and need to further study. I don't know if Drs. Cargile and Martinez have anything to say in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree, with the social media, we get everything instantaneously. And so when we see these things, we think, oh my God, the world's falling apart. But the reality is, and I think Dr. Cargile and Dr. Kraybill laid it out very well, there are laws that say you cannot do this stuff. And so, while we might see people on Facebook exercising their Facebook muscles and saying whatever they want to say and get ugly with one another, the reality is that most Americans want to exchange and have exchanges with one another that are quite decent. And so what we see in social media, unfortunately, it's right in our face. And so we tend to over exaggerate what we're looking at. I like to still believe that vast majority of my friends who say ugly things on Facebook are very good people still. And that's what I'm going to continue to believe.
I think there's an emboldened factor, Dr. Martinez, sometimes on social media. For some reason, maybe we need to talk to a psychologist, but we psychologically disassociate because we're not right in front of them. So things that we would probably never say in person, right, we might be more emboldened to say on social media.
Thank you. Our next question, and Dr. Kraybill, I saw that you answered this already directly to Matthew, but it's from Matthew Perez. He says, nowhere in the U.S. Constitution does it say media sources may declare a winner. Every major news network has called the election in favor of the presidential ticket of Biden and Harris. Newsmax, for instance, has not called this election because they believe there's not a winner just yet. As political scientists, do you believe there is an official winner by not factoring what our Constitution says about this process?
Well, and thank you so much. And Matthew has been in many of my classes, and I always enjoy these exchanges with him. So thank you so much for being here, Mr. Perez. One thing, like we always say in class, the Constitution doesn't specifically address a host of things. And in our system, yes, we operate on the Constitution, but we also know that presidents are precedent setters, and we have customs in this country that past presidents have followed. And usually the way that it has worked is when there has been a clear projected winner, the incumbent, if they have lost, has conceded. I gave the example of Hillary Clinton. There's even the example of George H.W. Bush. There's the example of Jimmy Carter when it comes to the election of Ronald Reagan. One thing is, you're right, Matthew, an election is not over on election day. It still has to go through the certification process. Donald Trump can contest it, but there are looming deadlines he is facing, such as the Electoral College, and even before that, individual states' certification dates. And as those get certified, and even if you have a recount and it goes in the favor of President-elect Biden and President-elect Harris again, he will get to a point, I'm assuming, based on my background and experience in this, that he will get to a point where he will most likely exhaust his options. But if he wants to continue this, just like George W. Bush said over the weekend when he released his statement, he stated that he felt that this was a fair election, but that President Trump could, pursue these options. If that's what the president wants to do, that's what the president can do, but it's not going to impede these other deadlines that are rapidly approaching. And it is something he is going against the grain against on precedent. Now that this administration will tell you they're not, because they go back to the Clinton administration when and I want to mention something about that. That transition was late about 37 days because of the contested election in Florida of 537 votes. The 9/11 Commission came out and stated that delay of properly transitioning was part of the reason why we were left vulnerable for September 11th, because the Bush administration was behind on important intelligence briefings. So we also have to remember, we have that practice of peaceful transition. We have that practice of putting country before party. And I think that those are also very important, things that we as an American people need to consider. But I appreciate the spirit of the question. And I think it's important for us to all be debating about it as Americans. So thank you.
Well, let me add that since we're political scientists, one of the things we want to try to understand is that the election has not been called, but more importantly, we still have a process in Georgia. And I can tell you, if you keep your base riled up, and this is what I see McConnell and Trump doing, and they're, politically speaking, if the shoe was on the other foot, the Democrats would be doing the same. Let's keep our base riled up. Why? Because there are 2 Senate seats that are going to be contested. And so unfortunately, many people don't like the game playing, but the reality is if you're a Republican, you want to see this stuff contested, you want to see the base frothing at the mouth, you want to see people excited about the election in Georgia. And so unfortunately, that's kind of playing a part in what we're seeing as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Daniela Gutierrez asks, where do you all stay updated on what's going on politically? Like what news source, and how do you know who to trust as a reliable source?
I call Jeanine. Go ahead, Dr. Kraybill.
Well, to be honest, I look at a cross section of sources. A lot of even when I think Dr. Martinez, myself, and Dr. Cargile are reading a news article, because obviously we care about current events and want to be informed and even keep our courses current. Our experience in the peer-reviewed side of the house informs how we read those pieces. So that is something, just because of our training, which you're developing now, and one day you'll even be better experts than us, right? That I think that rigorous standard of peer review does kind of at times give us a little bit of a different edge when we are processing a news article and looking for, okay, well, they're saying this poll, but what was their sample size? What was the question? When was this done? They're not taking into consideration this demographic. So our training, goes into how we process mainstream media. That's why when you're sitting in our classes and we're giving you peer-reviewed articles to read, we want you to read them, because we're wanting you to develop those skills so you can ascertain what is looking suspicious. Another thing too is you've got to read from multiple sources. So I will look at NPR, I'll look at the Wall Street Journal. I will, I'll also look at the Pew Research Center. I am a politics and religion scholar, so there's a host of other databases and stuff that I will look like. I know that Dr. Cargile also does the same thing when she has perhaps, and Dr. Martinez, certain mainstream ones they look at, but then they'll go back to think tanks and their peer-reviewed resources. So that's another thing. The other thing too is we dialogue with one another, like we're doing right now, right? To kind of tease out these ideas. So that's some of the things that I do. And another thing too, and I'll be honest with you, and it's not just because I give them analysis. I have to say that PolitiFact is a very good source. They really do hit up academics I've been a person that's been fact checking for them, and others too. They will go to actual academics and say, does this look right? Have you heard these statistics before? What's the history behind this commentary? And so I really feel like also that is a good source to look at in terms of fact checking politicians in our American politic.
I would also say, to add to what has already been said, is also avoid getting your information from social media. Please really
Yes.
and go into actual sources. There are so many online news sources that exist, like Dr. Kraybill was saying, there's the Wall Street Journal, there's the Washington Post. The Washington Post, speaking about, this idea of reaching out to academics, the Washington Post has a specific opinion section that they call the Monkey Cage blog. And the Monkey Cage blog is actually led by and pretty much 99% of it is written by academics. So it's people who are researching these topics, and they go from American politics all the way to international politics and the politics of other countries. And these are people who are accustomed to peer review. They know research methods. They know how to critically analyze and digest the different situations that are happening in real life. So I would really recommend the Monkey Cage. I would recommend getting out of the social media bubble, right? Getting out of just if your parents or if the people you live with or you yourself are a news junkie and are watching a specific news channel or are only reading particular news outlets, go to the other side and also see what they're saying, right? Really try to keep that balance, because it is important to make sure that you are looking at maybe the same issue through the lens of a conservative media outlet and a liberal media outlet. And then you yourself need to then use the training that you're receiving at CSUB, the training that you're receiving in your major, and apply those critical thinking skills to what makes sense, right? Like based on your lived experience, what seems to be right? What have you learned in history classes about the way that foreign policy works? What have you learned in your Intro to American Politics or other political science classes or other economics classes? This is why GE is so important, right? So it's to use the training that you're receiving to help you funnel through that information and to really digest all the information that is there. But please go outside of social media.
And one other thing I would add too is that if you can, to the extent that you can, international news sources are wonderful. And Der Spiegel, and I say this in my classes all the time, the best newsman in all of the Americas is Jorge Ramos. And if you haven't ever watched him, he doesn't do a lot of stuff in English, but he got called out by Donald Trump very early on in the presidential election. As a matter of fact, he was escorted out by Donald Trump bodyguards or whatever. It was pretty ugly. But the point is that if you can do the international stuff, BBC is wonderful. And anyway, so I'll leave it there.
I would just echo, and you'll have to forgive me. I actually have to go on to another panel, so I have to leave. I don't want to be the one to end this, so you can continue. But what Dr. Cargile said in regards to the Washington Post, absolutely. Same with what Dr. Martinez said. And then again, if you are interested in religion and politics, there is a religion and politics blog that's done by Paul Jupe out of Denison, and that's all academics that write for it. So there are sources where either in the mainstream media, academics, they solicit our expertise, and we'll write a truncated piece. And so those are some things to look for as well. And I apologize that I have to go to a panel, but thank you so much. And this was great. And I hope you all stay engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kraybill. It is 4:03, and I want to be mindful of our panelists' time. So I would like to thank Drs. Cargile, Kraybill, and Martinez for the presentations today as we seek to understand our recent elections. We had a lot of positive comments from our attendees, both from students and from our colleagues, who thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. We sincerely appreciate your time and your willingness to come together to have this discussion. Thank you again, Drs. Cargile and Dr. Martinez. Our next community conversation is scheduled for Thursday, November 19th at 11 a.m. and will focus on hunger and homelessness in Kern County and at CSUB. Thank you again and have a wonderful Tuesday afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.